Welcome to the next class in our series on Shabbos, Inside Out. Today we're going to look at the subject of Oneg Shabbos, having delight in Shabbos. If you ever go to a Chabad family, it's likely on Shabbos day that they would sing a Zmiros, a song on Shabbos called Asade Lisudasa. It's got a beautiful tune. Asade Lisudasa B'tzafre de Shabbata. It's written by the famous Kabbalist, the Arizal, and it's an acrostic of his name. It's the first letters of the sentences read out Ani Yitzchak Luria, and in the fourth sentence, there's a sentence that reads Yegalen la me devis reisa nahame diino nas bishmei kfila uklisha. What does that mean? It means we ask Hashem to disclose to us the reason for the 12 breads, which symbolize a letter of his name, both in the combined and the single form. Well, it's actually quite difficult to understand what these Zemiros mean, but today we're going to go right to the very beginning and have a look at what constitutes Oneg Shabbos, delighting in Shabbos, especially Shabbos foods, and we're going to explain the difference between eating during the weekday and the foods we eat on Shabbos. So let's go all the way back to the beginning. There is a verse in Yeshayahu in the prophet Isaiah, chapter 58, verse 13. There the prophet says, if you restrain your foot because it's Shabbos, refrain from accomplishing your own needs on my holy day, if you proclaim the Shabbos a delight and the holy day of Hashem honored, and you honor it by not engaging in your own affairs, from seeking your own needs or discussing the forbidden, then you will delight in Hashem, and I will mount you astride the heights of the world. I will provide you the heritage of your forefather Jacob, for the mouth of Hashem has spoken. So if you actually delineate what the prophet is saying, he's saying that a person should restrain their foot, meaning that our movements and walking on Shabbos should be different than the weekday. Accomplishing your own deeds, which means that on Shabbos we should consider all our work done and we shouldn't discuss business or mundane affairs on Shabbos. And then he says, V'korasa la Shabbos Oneg, we should call or proclaim Shabbos a delight. And there is the concept of kavod, honoring Shabbos, which we'll discuss separately today, however, we're going to discuss the concept of Oneg. V'korasa la Shabbos Oneg. Call Shabbos a delight. How do we do that? So, our sages, there's a Mechilta in Parshas Boi and a Sifra in Parshas Emor, both say, and this is brought in the Shulchan Aruch in the Code of Jewish Law in Hilchas Shabbos, Siman Reish Mem Beis, section 242, that Oneg Shabbos means that we should delight in Shabbos with pleasurable eating and drinking. Now, in the days of the Gemara, they would derive pleasure by eating large fish and a dish of cooked spinach. Those foods were considered pleasurable in that era. In every place, says the Shulchan Aruch, people should eat on Shabbos foods that are considered a delight to eat in that location. There is no specific obligation to eat meat or drink wine on Shabbos. The common practice is to eat meat because most people derive pleasure from eating meat. However, if a person is, for example, a a vegetarian or a person who doesn't have pleasure from eating meat or is vegan, there is no obligation to do so. There is an obligation to eat foods which are a delight. And the custom is that we eat fish by every meal of Shabbos. And the fish is eaten before the meat. So that's why we always serve fish and then we have soup or meat or cholent, whichever it is. One of the reasons we eat fish on Shabbos is because the Hebrew word for a fish is a dag, daled gimel. Numerically, daled is 4, gimel is 3, 4 plus 3 is 7. It's the 7th day of the week. Another reason is because the eino pikicha, the eye of the fish, is always open. The fish doesn't have eyelids. And the watchful eye of Hashem is always upon us. And there are many other reasons offered for eating fish on Shabbos. It's customary to eat gefilte fish, fish which has been filleted, because we don't want to transgress the prohibition of boirer, of separation. So if we had a bony fish, we may come to take the bones away from the fish. And that's prohibited on Shabbos. If one is eating a fish with bones, one should separate the fish from the bones and eat it immediately. It's also customary that one should bake challah on Shabbos. Of course, one could buy from a bakery. However, the custom of many women is to bake special challah for Shabbos. On Friday night, on Shabbos day, we need to have 2 challahs, lechem mishnah. There is a custom brought in Kabbalah to have 12 challahs. Some ladies make what's called a yud beis challah. It's like 12 small bulkas, small rolls, all put together. And this reminds us of the lechem haponim, the 12 showbreads that were in the Mishkan, in the tabernacle. Of course, the double bread, the lechem mishnah, having 2 challahs, reminds us of the double portion of manna that fell in the wilderness on Friday. Of course, the man did not fall on Shabbos. The more one spends on good food and good drink on Shabbos, the more praiseworthy. In fact, our sages say that a person's budget is fixed on Rosh Hashanah for the entire year, apart from the expenses of Shabbos and Yom Tov and Rosh Chodesh. In fact, it says there is a word Tishrei, Tovshin, Reish Yud. Tov stands for Torah, Shin Shabbos, Reish Rosh Chodesh, Yud Yom Tov. Those are the exceptions which are not included in a person's budget on Rosh Hashanah. So, for example, if a person spends money on Torah, teachers, education, books, Sfarim, or on Shabbos, buying nicer food and wine, and similarly on Rosh Chodesh and Yom Tov, a person is given an increase to the budget that was given to them on Rosh Hashanah. And of course, when we go shopping during the week, we should always be on the lookout for food to buy, especially for Shabbos. And when we do so, when we purchase the food, we should say, Zeh l'chvod Shabbos, this is in honor of Shabbos. So, Oneg Shabbos is, as our sages say, connected with having a delight on Shabbos through good food and good drink. That's the halacha. Now we're going to have a look at the inner dimension of eating foods of delight on Shabbos. In our previous classes, we've explained that on Shabbos, there's an elevation of all the worlds. On Shabbos, as we explained, the worlds are created from a higher source, from the level of thought rather than the level of deed. On Shabbos, everything is elevated. And we're going to have a look at that elevation specifically in this class in reference to food. Before we do so, let's have a look at the concept of food and eating in general. In the works of Chassidus, there's a tremendous amount of discussion around the concept of a human being being nourished by the mineral, vegetable, and animal. After all, doesn't the human being stand at the apex of the pyramid? At the bottom you have the mineral kingdom, the vegetable kingdom, the animal, and at the top of that pyramid you have the human being. The human being far surpasses all in intelligence and creativity. And yet when it comes to sustenance, the human being is completely dependent on all of them. Well, principally on the minerals and the vegetables. And then, of course, there's the animal, but principally on the minerals and vegetables for their nourishment and for their livelihood. Why is it that a human being must depend on these lower forms of existence in order to live? So there's a beautiful explanation given in Chassidus, which uses the concept brought in Kabbalah of Shaviras HaKelim. Kabbalah explains the genesis of evil. In order to have a world of free choice, in order to have reward and punishment, it's necessary to create evil. But how did evil stem from the Godhead? The answer is that in its very root, evil was a form of very refined ego. The Midrash says that God created worlds and destroyed them before he created this world. The Kabbalah explains that there were different worlds, different states. The state that came before this world was called the world of Tohu, the world of chaos. In that world, it was a world of Oiris Merubim, tremendous lights and energies. However, each one of the Kalim, the vessels in that world, was exclusive. It didn't want to share the light with the other. Each one desired all the light for itself. And because the light was so intense, the vessel shattered. That was called Shviras HaKelim, the breakage of the vessels. And these vessels shattered into numerous sparks, 288 sparks, which fell down the chain order of creation. So God built a world and then destroyed it. And then a new world was built called the world of Tikkun, of rectification. In that world you had the opposite. The Oiros, the lights, were few, small, and the Kalim, the vessels, were large. And they were inclusive. So each one of the vessels joined with the other in order to receive the lights. This is a long and deep subject discussed in Chassidus and Kabbalah. It's explained by the Arizal on a particular passage in the Torah, which the Torah speaks about the 7 kings, and each one reigning and then dying, reigning and dying. And these kings represent the Sephiros of the world of Tohu, in which each one wanted all the oir, the light, for itself. And because it was exclusive and not inclusive, because it wanted all the light for itself, it was too intense, it shattered. That was a chaotic form of existence. Now, of course, these two states still exist, and they exist simultaneously. There are, even in the human condition, moments of chaos and moments of order. what is the difference between the two? A chaotic moment is powerful, but it's all over the place. Whereas in order, you've got less power, but everything comes in its right place. Now, when the vessels of the world of Tohu shattered, the sparks of those vessels fell very low. In fact, we have a rule that what is highest falls the lowest. And these sparks actually fell into the mineral, vegetable, and animal kingdoms. There is, in fact, a verse in Tehillim which says, Ocher v'kedem saratoni. In chapter 139, verse 5 of Tehillim, it says, last, but first, you have formed me. So the Gemara in Brachas, page 61a, explains that this is a reference to the creation of man. Man was created last in the 6 days of creation. And if man sins, says the Talmud, then we can say to him, even a gnat, G-N-A-T, came before you. Everything came before you. On the one hand, creation was rolled out in order that man should come in like a king at the end into the palace. On the other hand, everything came before the creation of man. And so, Ocher, last, Vokedem, but first in thought, Saratoni, you have made me. Chassidus gives a different dimension in understanding this. And it says, Ocher, man was created last, because he was from the world of Tikkun. However, he's nourished and sustained by sparks which fell from the world of Tohu. So when a person takes some food and eats food, what actually is happening is that the energy within the spark of Tohu, which is within the food, is nourishing the man who is from the state of Tikkun. Let's have a look at a verse in Mishlei in Proverbs. In Mishlei chapter 13, verse 25, it says, Tzadik oichel l'soiva nafshoi uveten reshoim techsor. A righteous person eats to satisfy his soul, but the stomach of the wicked is always lacking. What does that mean? So, the Metzudas David, one of the commentaries, says that the tzaddik doesn't desire delicacies. Rather, he just eats to sustain himself. However, the wicked always wants more food. There's always room for dessert. And he can always fill himself up. He is always lacking because he's always looking for more delicacies. That is the simple meaning of the pasuk. However, Chassidus gives a very beautiful and deep explanation over here and says the following. Tzaddik, we're talking about a elevated tzaddik, oichel eats, l'soiva, to satiate his soul. It doesn't say to satiate his body, rather to satiate the soul. Why? Because the tzaddik feels the spiritual root of the food. There is a spark of holiness in that food. The tzaddik can discern that spark, and his soul, which comes from the state of tikkun, desires that, because the energy in the world of Tohu is in fact greater than that in the world of tikkun. And that is what the tzaddik is looking for. Tzaddik oichel l'soiva nafshay. The tzaddik is eating in order to satisfy his soul. That is one level of eating. However, there is another level of eating, and that second level of eating is uveten reshoim yachzar. What does that mean? That means as follows. If a person eats for the sake of heaven, they're not a tzaddik, but they are eating for the sake of heaven. What does that mean? They're not eating just to gorge themselves. They're not eating because of the taiva, the desire to eat it. Rather, they're eating in order to be healthy, in order to serve Hashem. That is what it means when it says eating l'shem shamayim, eating for the sake of heaven. Then they prevent nourishment going to the chitzonim, to the klippos. Klippa is the term used by Kabbalah for evil. Klippa means peel. The peel of a fruit is necessary to preserve the fruit. However, when one wishes to eat the fruit, one discards the peel. Similarly, the presence of klippos in the world, of evil in the world, is only there in order to maintain free choice. But once we've chosen and extracted the good from the bad, the klippa is discarded. The last thing that we want to do is to give nourishment to the klippa. So that tzaddik, oichel l'seva nafshoy, eats to satiate his soul, uveten rishoim, and when a person eats for the sake of heaven, the stomach of the wicked, yachzar, is lacking the nourishment that would come if a person would eat the food not for the sake of heaven. If a person ate just to gorge themselves, and because of the taiva, as it says in Bereshis, for example, that there was a tremendous taiva to eat the Eitz Hadas, to eat the tree of knowledge. It was taiva hu le'einayim, that's the expression in the pasuk. It was a desire for the eyes. It was nechmad lemara. It was very desirable to look at. So if a person's eating simply because of the desire, what that does is it shoots the chayas, the energy within the food, into the chitzonim, into the klippas, into the other side of holiness, and one feeds the side of evil. Whereas if a person eats l'shem shamayim, for the sake of heaven, then what happens is that one transforms the spark of holiness which is in the food, and one elevates it so that the chayas, the energy, doesn't go to the side of the klippa. So uvet and rishoim yachsa means the stomach of the wicked is lacking the nourishment because it has been elevated into holiness. We can therefore understand that during the weekday, the act of boirer, of separation, is heavily involved. A person must take away the good from the bad. A person must extract the spark to and elevate it to its source. It's interesting to note that the Hebrew word for bread is lechem. The Hebrew word for a battle is a milchama. They're closely related. First of all, a person has to produce bread by the sweat of their brow. It's actually a difficult food to make if one's making it from scratch, growing the wheat and going through all the various malachas, works in order to produce flour and then bake it into bread and so on and so forth. But on the other hand, it's one of the most sustaining foods. The word lachem is closely related to milchama because during the week when a person eats the bread, they have to wage war in order to eat the bread for the sake of heaven. Because then what they're trying to do is to release the divine spark which is within the bread and elevate it to its source, thereby giving nourishment to the state of tikkun. The spark of toyu is being elevated and into tikkun, and it's providing additional koyach, power to the person to serve Hashem. This is what happens during the week. However, as we mentioned at the beginning, on Shabbos, all the worlds have an elevation. And due to this elevation, what happens is that even without having to wage war with oneself, one can access the spirituality, that spark within the food. It's almost as if before Shabbos comes in, as is mentioned in the Pri-Eitz Chaim by Reb Chaim Vital, the klipa falls away, the externals fall away, and we are granted access to the spiritual energy inside the food. And that spiritual energy allows a person a deeper devekus, a deeper connection and cleaving to Hashem, especially in the tefillah and Torah of Shabbos, in the davening and in the learning of Shabbos. There's another pasuk in Eov, which also expresses this idea. In the book of Eov, in chapter 20, verse 15, Eov says, Chayil bola vayekienu, mi bitnoi yorishenu keil. Chayil, the simple meaning, says the Metzudas David, is the concept of oisher, wealth. Chayil bola, this wicked man swallows wealth, but it won't remain by him, because vayakienu, he will disgorge it, and Hashem will make sure to remove that wealth from his stomach. That's the simple translation of the pasuk. However, according to Chassidus, there is a deeper explanation, and that is Chayil is a reference to the godly spark which is within the food. Chayil bola, initially that godly spark was swallowed up in the food, vayekienu. However, ultimately it will be taken out, and it will be inherited by God, meaning it will return to its original source. Now we understand, therefore, that the eating of the weekday is very different than the eating on Shabbos. The foods of the weekday are different than the foods of Shabbos. During the weekday, a person has to wage war with the food, in the sense that a person has to make sure to eat l'shem shamayim, to eat for the sake of heaven, which means to eat in order to be healthy. And as explained in Tanya, if a person eats just l'shem taiva, in order to fulfill a desire, because it's mosig l'cheich, it's sweet to the palate, and it's just nice tasting, and a person dives straight into some gastronomic delight, that creates klipa. That creates nourishment to the side of unholiness. Eventually, it says a person can elevate that if the food that they ate was kosher, and ultimately the body, in its disintegration in the grave, in chibut hakever, disintegrates because what was created, the flesh and blood from that, was not necessarily from the side of holiness. Whereas It says that tzaddik, for example, their bodies do not disintegrate in the grave because all their eating was l'soiv nafshe, for the purpose of their feeding their soul. The truth is, that's one element of disintegration. It says ve'lofa toshuv, that we should go back to the dust as an element of bittul, but there is an aspect of chibut hakever, of the refining of the body in the grave because of the lack of focus and concentration. But for us, in our generation, we need to focus during the week on eating l'shem shamayim, which means eating for the sake of heaven, which means eating in order to be healthy, in order to serve Hashem with simcha, with joy. On Shabbos, however, what we can do is we can bypass, if you want, that battle, and we can directly access the spiritual energy in the food, and that's called Oneg Shabbos. That's called the delight of Shabbos. And hence, this is why it says that on Shabbos one should buy and eat basa v'dagim v'chol matamim, meat, fish, all delicacies, even though during the week a person needs to eat only for the sake of heaven in order to be healthy, and you don't really need all these delicacies. But on Shabbos, yes. Why? Because Shabbos we can access that deeper spirituality within the food, and the food itself nourishes our souls in order to have a deeper connection to Hashem when we eat that food. And that's why the foods of Shabbos, when we eat them, and we say, Zelekavod Shabbos, this is in order to honor Shabbos, and this is a tremendous Oneg of Shabbos, a delight for Shabbos. When we eat the Shabbos foods in that way, it actually adds to our capability, to our spiritual sensitivity, in order to feel and daven and learn better. Now we can understand what the Arizal said, Yigalan lo'antame de b'srei sename. Hashem should reveal to us the meaning of the 12 breads. Of course, in Kabbalah, the 12 breads have great significance. According to some, they refer to the 12 different combinations of the 4-letter name of Hashem, the Tetragrammaton. According to others, they represent the 12 showbreads in the Mishkan, and however it's explained in Kabbalah, the idea is the 12 showbreads represent a certain level of revelation of Hashem's name that comes through eating the breads. So by eating the challah on Shabbos, the idea is not just to dwell on the tastiness of the challah, although challah should taste nicely, and it's part of the oneg, part of the delight. However, principally, when we're eating the challah and all the foods of Shabbos, what we're aiming to do is to gain the spiritual energy which is in these foods, that they should enhance our deep connection with Hashem. That's the true Oneg Shabbos, and this is called Lehisanik al Hashem, to delight in Hashem. So, the Arizal says like this, Yegalan lo'antame de b'srei sename, let Hashem reveal to us the secret of these 12 breads, di'inun os b'shmei, because they are a letter in His name. In other words, these breads represent a certain revelation, kefila or klisha, weak and doubled, combined and single. What does that mean? So, the Alter Rebbe explains that the letter Yud can extend into the letter Vav. And the letter Yud is the idea of contraction, focus into a point that can be drawn down. So the idea of the Yud being drawn into a Vav means that the focused, contracted form of godliness can be drawn down into this world, but in a very contracted manner. Even more so is when we have a double, such as the letter Hey. Hey, of course, can be written either Hey Aleph or Hey Hey. But the difference between the two Heys, if we write it Hey Hey, is that the second Hey is again a step down from the first Hey. It's what's called in Kabbalah a milui. It fills, just when we say the word Aleph, for example, you've got three letters, Aleph, Lamed, Fei. So the Lamed and the Fei is the milui of the Aleph. It fills the whole letter of the Aleph. So when you've got a Hey and a Hey, it represents a further expansion and contraction of the initial Hey down a level. So Bizman Hazeh, in this time, explains the Alter Rebbe in the Maimei Galalon Tame in Chayesara, in Torah Oyer, we do not have access to the higher levels of revelation in the bread. This is what the Arizal said, we ask for Yegalan Lontame, that in time to come, when Mashiach will come, and in Tchias HaMesim, will be able to access the deeper and the deepest, if you want, levels of holiness within the breads themselves. Nowadays, it's kfila or klisha, it's a contracted form. Nevertheless, we see from all the above that the eating of Shabbos truly is a very different type of eating than what we're used to. During the week, we should eat minimally in order to sustain body and soul, in order to be healthy. On Shabbos, we should eat all the delicacies, wine, meat, whatever is a food of delicacy. But essentially, what we're looking to do in that eating of Shabbos is not to engage in the battle of the weekdays, whose dynamic is milamata lamaila, taking from below and extracting the spark and elevating it above, but rather the dynamic of Shabbos is milamaila lamata, having direct access to the spiritual energy which is within the food and drawing it down into our souls on Shabbos, thereby enhancing our spiritual sensitivity so that our dvekas, our cleaving, and our sense of knowing and feeling Hashem, feeling the Kedusha of Shabbos, is completely enhanced by the Oneg, by the delight which we have when we eat the foods of Shabbos. And obviously, one needs to eat the foods of Shabbos in that manner. Be'ezras Hashem, with the help of Hashem, we will have a look in the next class at the various levels of Shabbos. There isn't, in fact, a uniform level in the Shabbos. There's a Friday night, there's a Shabbos day, and there's a Suda Shlishis. And there are 3 meals of Shabbos itself. There's the Friday night meal, there's a Shabbos day meal, and the Suda Shlishis, there's the 3rd meal of Shabbos. And each one of the 3 of them have a different spiritual caliber. And we have to bear that in mind when we're looking at the different foods that we eat on Friday night and on Shabbos day and on Suda Shlishis, as Be'ezras Hashem we will explain. However, now it says that as somebody who does take great delight in Shabbos will be forgiven for all their sins. It's a great, great thing to honor and to delight in Shabbos properly. So even now, during the weekday, when you're looking at this video, when you go to the store, keep your eye out for some beautiful delicacy for Shabbos. And when you purchase it, just say Zel Kavod Shabbos. This should be for the honor of Shabbos.